The year was 1943, and somewhere in the vast Pacific Ocean, a single radio operator's desperate fingers danced across Morse code keys as Japanese fighter planes screamed overhead. What happened next would become one of the most incredible survival stories of World War II. A tale of ingenuity, courage, and the human will to live when all hope seemed lost. This is the true story of how one man's knowledge of radio frequencies became the difference between life and death for dozens of souls lost at sea. The USS Helena's communication room buzzed with urgent radio chatter as Petty Officer Second Class Thomas "Tommy" Crawford monitored incoming signals from across the Pacific Theater. At 24 years old, Tommy had already earned a reputation as one of the finest radio operators in the Navy, capable of picking up the faintest transmissions through static that would defeat most other men. His calloused fingers moved across the equipment with practiced precision, adjusting frequencies and filtering through the constant stream of military communications that flowed through the airwaves like digital blood through electronic veins. On this particular morning in July 1943, the Helena was part of a convoy heading toward the Solomon Islands, where Allied forces were preparing for another major offensive against entrenched Japanese positions. The ship cut through choppy waters under overcast skies that seemed to press down on the ocean like a grey blanket. Tommy had been on duty for nearly 18 hours straight, his eyes burning from staring at the radio equipment's glowing dials, and his ears constantly covered by heavy headphones that made his head ache. The first sign of trouble came not from the radio, but from the ship's lookouts, who spotted enemy aircraft approaching from the northeast. Air raid sirens began wailing across the convoy as sailors rushed to battle stations. Tommy remained at his post, continuing to monitor emergency frequencies even as anti-aircraft guns began thundering above his head. The Helena's communication room was located deep within the ship's armored interior, but he could still feel the vibrations of explosions and the sharp turns the vessel made as it attempted evasive maneuvers. When the first torpedo struck the Helena's port side, the impact threw Tommy against his radio equipment, with enough force to crack two of his ribs. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main power failed, casting eerie red shadows across the communication room. Water began seeping through damaged bulkheads, and Tommy realized with growing horror that the ship was taking on water faster than the damage control teams could handle it. Still, he remained at his radio, sending out distress signals and trying to coordinate rescue efforts for other vessels in the convoy that had also been hit. The second torpedo strike came 20 minutes later, sealing the Helena's fate. The massive explosion tore through the ship's engine room, and Tommy felt the deck beneath his feet begin to tilt at an increasingly steep angle. Orders came over the ship's intercom to abandon ship, but Tommy continued transmitting coordinates and casualty reports until the very last moment. As seawater began flooding the communication room, he grabbed a portable emergency radio and a waterproof case containing spare batteries and crystals before following other crew members toward the nearest escape route. Emerging onto the Helena's tilting deck, Tommy was struck by the chaos surrounding him. The convoy was scattered across miles of ocean, with several ships burning or already partially submerged. Japanese planes continued their attack runs, strafing lifeboats and survivors in the water with machine gun fire. The Helena was listing heavily to starboard now, her bow already disappearing beneath the waves. Tommy helped launch one of the remaining lifeboats before the ship's final death throes forced him to jump into the oil-slicked Pacific waters. The shock of hitting the cold ocean knocked the breath from his lungs, and for several terrifying moments, Tommy struggled to stay afloat while debris rained down around him. His life jacket kept him buoyant, but the weight of his emergency radio equipment threatened to drag him under. Somehow, he managed to swim toward a partially inflated life raft that had broken free from the sinking Helena. 3 other sailors had already reached the raft, and together they hauled Tommy aboard just as the great ship made its final plunge beneath the waves. As night fell, Tommy found himself adrift in the Pacific, with 17 other survivors crammed into a life raft designed for 12 people. They had limited food and water supplies, no navigation equipment, and no way to signal their location to potential rescue vessels. The Japanese attack had scattered the convoy so thoroughly that surviving ships were miles away, focused on their own damage control and rescue operations. Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising rough weather that would make their situation even more desperate. Tommy carefully examined his salvaged radio equipment and discovered that while the main unit had been damaged by seawater, he might be able to repair it using components from spare parts he had managed to grab. Working by moonlight, he began the delicate process of cleaning corrosion from circuit connections and testing each component. The other survivors watched hopefully as he worked, understanding that this radio might represent their only chance of being found in the vast expanse of ocean that surrounded them. By dawn, Tommy had managed to get the radio partially operational, but its range was severely limited, and the battery power was already beginning to fade. He began broadcasting distress signals on multiple frequencies, hoping to reach either Allied ships or aircraft that might be searching for convoy survivors. The first day passed without any response, and by evening, several of the wounded men in the raft were showing signs of serious infection and dehydration. The storm that had been threatening finally arrived on their second day adrift, bringing with it towering waves and driving rain that made survival even more precarious. The life raft was tossed around like a cork in a bathtub, and Tommy had to protect his radio equipment from the saltwater spray that constantly soaked everything. 2 of the wounded sailors died during the storm, their bodies committed to the ocean in brief, somber ceremonies that left the remaining survivors even more desperate and frightened. When the weather finally cleared on the 4th day, Tommy made a crucial discovery.
While monitoring radio frequencies,
he picked up faint transmissions from a Japanese naval patrol that seemed to be operating somewhere in their general area. While he couldn't understand the language, he was able to determine the approximate frequency range the enemy was using and began formulating a desperate plan. If he could somehow interfere with or redirect Japanese communications, he might be able to create enough confusion to attract the attention of Allied forces searching for the missing convoy. The plan was extremely risky because it would require Tommy to broadcast on enemy frequencies, potentially revealing their location to hostile forces. However, with their water supplies running critically low and several more men showing signs of severe dehydration, he decided they had no other choice. That evening, as the sun set over the endless Pacific, Tommy began implementing his dangerous strategy to turn enemy communications into their salvation. Tommy's hands trembled slightly as he fine-tuned his damaged radio equipment, preparing to execute the most dangerous gambit of his life. The plan he had conceived was both brilliant and terrifying in its simplicity. By monitoring Japanese naval frequencies, he had identified what appeared to be routine patrol communications between enemy vessels. If he could successfully jam or interfere with these transmissions at precisely the right moment, the resulting communication breakdown might force the Japanese patrol to investigate, potentially leading them directly to the life raft's location. The risk was enormous. If the Japanese discovered them first, the survivors would likely be machine-gunned in the water or taken prisoner, neither of which offered much hope for survival. However, Tommy had also noticed increased Allied air patrol activity over the past day, suggesting that rescue operations were still ongoing in their general area. His desperate hope was that by creating enough radio interference to disrupt enemy communications, he might attract the attention of Allied monitoring stations or aircraft that were intercepting Japanese transmissions. As darkness fell on their 5th day adrift, Tommy began his electronic warfare campaign. Using his knowledge of radio propagation and frequency modulation, he started broadcasting bursts of static and random Morse code on the frequencies he had identified as Japanese patrol channels. The technique was similar to methods used by Allied intelligence services to confuse enemy communications, but Tommy was improvising with damaged equipment and rapidly depleting battery power. The immediate effect was encouraging. Within an hour of beginning his interference campaign, Tommy detected increased radio chatter from the Japanese patrol, indicating that his jamming efforts were causing confusion and frustration among enemy operators. However, he also realized that his activities were undoubtedly being tracked by Japanese direction-finding equipment, and it would only be a matter of time before enemy vessels began converging on his position. The other survivors watched nervously as Tommy continued his dangerous radio work throughout the night. Seaman First Class Rodriguez, who had been wounded in the initial attack, kept watch for any signs of approaching vessels while Tommy focused on his equipment. The remaining 14 men tried to rest, but the tension was palpable as everyone understood they were now racing against time. Either Allied forces would find them first, or they would face the grim prospect of capture or death at Japanese hands. Dawn brought both hope and terror. On the horizon, Tommy spotted the distinctive silhouette of a Japanese destroyer moving in their general direction, its wake visible against the morning light. At the same time, his radio suddenly crackled to life with a transmission that made his heart leap with excitement. An American voice was broadcasting on an emergency frequency, apparently coordinating search and rescue operations for missing convoy personnel. Working frantically, Tommy began transmitting their coordinates and situation to the American radio operator, using the last of his battery power to boost the signal strength. The response came back almost immediately, confirming that his transmission had been received and that rescue aircraft were being dispatched to their location. However, the Japanese destroyer was also closing in, and Tommy estimated they had perhaps 30 minutes before the enemy vessel would be close enough to spot their small life raft. The next 25 minutes felt like hours as the survivors watched both the approaching Japanese destroyer and the sky for signs of Allied aircraft. Several men were now so weakened by dehydration and exposure that they could barely sit upright, and Tommy himself was operating on pure adrenaline and determination. His radio equipment finally died completely, the last battery drained by his desperate transmission efforts, leaving them with no way to provide updated position information to potential rescuers. The sound of aircraft engines suddenly echoed across the water, and Tommy felt a surge of hope as he spotted two American patrol planes approaching from the southeast. However, the Japanese destroyer had also detected the incoming aircraft and was increasing speed while turning toward the life raft's position. What followed was a deadly race between rescue and capture, with the survivors caught helplessly in the middle of the convergence. The lead American aircraft, a PBY Catalina flying boat, began its descent toward the water, while the second plane, a fighter escort, moved to intercept the Japanese destroyer. Tommy and the other survivors waved frantically to signal their location as the Catalina touched down on the ocean surface, approximately half a mile away. The Japanese destroyer, now clearly visible and closing fast, had begun firing its deck guns at the American aircraft. The Catalina's crew worked with incredible efficiency, taxiing across the choppy water toward the life raft while under fire from the enemy destroyer. Tommy helped drag the weakest survivors toward the aircraft's open hatch, as bullets whined overhead and shell splashes erupted dangerously close to both the rescue plane and the life raft. The fighter escort was making strafing runs against the destroyer, trying to suppress its anti-aircraft fire and give the Catalina crew time to complete the rescue operation. As the last survivor was pulled aboard the flying boat, Tommy took one final look at the life raft that had been their home for 5 harrowing days. The Japanese destroyer was less than 1,000 yards away now, close enough that he could see individual sailors manning the ship's weapons. The Catalina's engines roared to full power as the pilot began his takeoff run, racing across the water while enemy shells continued to explode around them. The flying boat lifted off just as the destroyer's main guns found their range, sending up massive waterspouts where the aircraft had been moments before. Tommy pressed his face against a window as they climbed away from the ocean, watching the enemy vessel grow smaller below them while the fighter escort continued to harass its crew with machine gun attacks. The rescue had succeeded, but barely, and Tommy realized that his radio warfare gambit had come within minutes of resulting in disaster rather than salvation. During the flight back to Allied territory, Tommy learned that his interference with Japanese communications had indeed been detected by American monitoring stations, who had triangulated his position and dispatched rescue aircraft accordingly. His desperate plan had worked exactly as hoped, creating enough confusion in enemy communications to attract Allied attention while simultaneously revealing his location to potential rescuers. The intelligence officers who debriefed him were fascinated by his improvised electronic warfare techniques and began incorporating similar methods into official military operations. As the Catalina approached their destination airfield, Tommy reflected on the incredible chain of events that had led to their rescue. His knowledge of radio operations, combined with desperate circumstances and sheer luck, had saved the lives of 18 men who would otherwise have been lost forever in the vast Pacific Ocean. However, he also understood that their ordeal was far from over, as the war continued to rage across the Pacific theater, and many more sailors and airmen would face similar life-or-death situations in the months ahead. The military hospital in New Zealand became Tommy's home for the next 6 weeks as doctors treated his injuries and malnutrition, while intelligence officers continued to debrief him about his improvised radio warfare techniques. The other survivors were recovering in nearby wards, and Tommy made daily visits to check on their progress and maintain the bonds forged during their harrowing 5 days adrift. Several of the men had suffered permanent health effects from their ordeal, but all 18 survivors would eventually return to active duty or civilian life. During his recovery, Tommy learned that his rescue had become something of a legend among Allied radio operators throughout the Pacific theater. Word of his creative use of electronic interference to attract rescue attention had spread through military communication networks, and he found himself receiving visits from senior officers who wanted to hear first-hand accounts of his techniques. The Navy's communication specialists were particularly interested in his methods for jamming enemy frequencies with limited equipment and power supplies. What Tommy didn't initially realize was that his actions had implications far beyond a single rescue operation. Allied intelligence had been monitoring Japanese naval communications for months, trying to break enemy codes and predict fleet movements. Tommy's interference campaign had revealed previously unknown details about Japanese communication protocols and frequency usage patterns that proved invaluable to code-breaking efforts. His desperate improvisation had accidentally contributed to a significant intelligence breakthrough. 3 months after his rescue, Tommy found himself assigned to a special communications unit, tasked with developing new electronic warfare techniques based on his experiences. The unit was stationed in Australia, where Allied forces were preparing for major offensive operations against Japanese-held islands throughout the Pacific. Tommy's role involved training other radio operators in advanced interference and jamming methods while also participating in the development of more sophisticated electronic warfare equipment. The work was fascinating, but also emotionally challenging for Tommy, who struggled with survivor's guilt and recurring nightmares about their time adrift. Several of his fellow Helena survivors were experiencing similar psychological effects, and the military's understanding of what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder was still quite limited. Tommy found that focusing on his technical work helped him cope with these difficulties, while also contributing meaningfully to the war effort. In early 1944, Tommy's unit received orders to participate in Operation Forager, the massive Allied campaign to capture the Mariana Islands. His specific mission involved establishing advanced radio monitoring stations on newly captured islands, where he would coordinate electronic intelligence gathering operations while also training local resistance fighters in basic radio techniques. The assignment represented both an opportunity to apply his hard-won expertise and a chance to directly support combat operations against the Japanese forces that had nearly killed him months earlier. The Mariana campaign proved to be every bit as challenging as Tommy had expected. Japanese defenders fought with fanatical determination, and the radio monitoring work often had to be conducted under enemy fire. However, Tommy's experiences as a survivor had given him a resilience and adaptability that served him well in these dangerous circumstances. His ability to maintain radio equipment and communications under the most adverse conditions became legendary among the units he supported. During the battle for Saipan, Tommy's electronic warfare expertise proved crucial in disrupting Japanese coordination efforts. Using techniques evolved from his desperate jamming campaign in the life raft, he and his team managed to create enough confusion in enemy communications to significantly aid Allied ground operations. The success of these efforts led to Tommy receiving a commendation and promotion to Chief Petty Officer, along with assignment to an even more specialized unit focused on communications intelligence. As the war progressed through 1944 and into 1945, Tommy continued to refine and teach electronic warfare techniques while also participating in some of the Pacific Theater's most important operations. His original survival story had become a training case study used throughout the Allied military, demonstrating how technical knowledge and creative thinking could overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. The methods he had improvised during 5 desperate days adrift were now being used by thousands of radio operators across the Pacific. The end of the war found Tommy stationed in the Philippines, where he was helping to establish permanent communication networks for post-war military operations. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, he was among the radio operators who transmitted news of the surrender across the Pacific, bringing word of peace to military units scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. For Tommy, there was particular satisfaction in knowing that his voice was carrying good news rather than the desperate distress calls that had once been his specialty. After the war, Tommy returned to civilian life but remained connected to many of his fellow Helena survivors. They formed an informal association that met annually to commemorate their rescue and maintain the friendships forged during their ordeal. Several of the men went on to careers in electronics and communications, directly applying skills they had learned during their military service. Tommy himself became a radio engineer, eventually founding a small company that developed emergency communication equipment for maritime use. In the decades following the war, Tommy's story continued to be told in military training programs and survival courses. His demonstration that technical knowledge and creative problem-solving could overcome desperate circumstances became a standard case study for military communications personnel. The specific electronic warfare techniques he had improvised were eventually incorporated into official military doctrine and continued to evolve with advancing technology. Perhaps most importantly, Tommy's experience demonstrated the crucial importance of maintaining hope and continuing to fight for survival, even when circumstances appear hopeless. His decision to risk everything on a desperate radio gambit rather than simply waiting for rescue had saved not only his own life, but the lives of 17 other men. The story became a powerful example of how individual initiative and expertise could make the difference between life and death, even in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. When Tommy passed away in 1987 at the age of 68, his funeral was attended by several of his fellow Helena survivors, as well as dozens of radio operators and electronic warfare specialists, whose careers had been influenced by his wartime innovations. His legacy lived on not only in the lives he had saved and the techniques he had developed, but in the countless military personnel who had learned from his example that technical expertise combined with courage and creativity could overcome even the most desperate situations. The portable radio equipment Tommy had used during his 5 days adrift was eventually recovered from the Catalina that had rescued them and is now displayed in the National Museum of World War II in New Orleans. A small plaque beside the exhibit tells the story of how one man's knowledge of radio frequencies became the key to survival for 18 sailors lost in the vast Pacific Ocean, turning what should have been a tragedy into one of the war's most inspiring tales of ingenuity, courage, and the indomitable human spirit. Hit 6 targets consecutively, claimed the Virgin servant. The Blood Rider raised his rifle. Then,